I was recently asked the question, is it better to shoot at 24 frames per second 4K or 120 frames per second HD? And I think the reason for this question is that as your camera gets to a higher frame rate, it usually goes to a lower resolution. So the question really is, should I compromise on my frame rate or should I compromise on my resolution? Now, frame rate and resolution are entirely different. Frame rate is really a creative decision, whereas resolution isn't. You always want a higher resolution, but you don't always want a higher frame rate. So the idea of using 24 frames per second 4K as being a compromise as opposed to 120 frames per second, that's really not the case. 24 frames per second and 120 frames per second, they're just used for totally different things. The resolution and the balance between the resolution and the frame rate doesn't really matter here. So choose 24 frames per second if you want to go for a cinematic look. 24 frames per second is kind of the industry standard. 120 frames per second, that's your slow motion shot, your super slow motion. So don't worry too much about the resolution. The frame rate is really a creative decision.